We're delighted tonight to have Daniel Gee come from Fisherfield Waterhouse. Second time he's been this year. Tonight he's talking about contemporary issues in sports law, particularly looking at football law. As those of you who look at sports law will know, a lot of the case law, a lot of the real areas of legal problems tend to be around football. So there will be a fair old helping of that, but not exclusively. As I think some of you know, Daniel's well-known sports lawyer. He's well-known in the media, been on Sky Sports News and other media in the past. He does a fantastic blog, which is linked in on the webpage if you look at that. We are streaming this live, those of you in the room. So there may be some odd questions coming through on the Twitter feed that we'll ask Daniel directly. I think Daniel's happy to be interrupted if you've got a specific question during the talk, or we can take some at the end. When we do that, if you put your hand up for the question, Sir Hap will come around with the radio mic to get your questions. Okay, so without further ado, I shall pass you over to Daniel to talk about contemporary issues in sports law.
Thanks, Guy. Okay, so my name is Daniel Gee. I'm a lawyer at law firm Fieldfisher Waterhouse, and just for the next maybe 35, 40 minutes, I'm going to chat about some of the things that crop up and come across my desk on a daily, weekly, sort of monthly basis, with specific focus, obviously, on sports law. So by way of background, I'm a competition lawyer in the sports group at Fieldfisher Waterhouse. An increasing amount of my time is spent on sports law-related matters, but also on football law-related matters, and that's my passion in a way. I'm a Liverpool fan. I've always been interested in football-related matters. I got a smirk there. I'm not sure if that was a good thing or not. And ever since I did my master's degree, actually, with one of Guy's colleagues, Mark James, in football broadcasting rights, ever since then, I've been lucky enough during my training contract and throughout the last 7, 8 years of my legal profession to be able to work on some relatively high-profile sports matters. So for the next 40, 45 minutes, I said 35, didn't I? 35, 40 minutes, I'm going to try and talk primarily about three things. And I'm sorry for those in the back who might not be able to see this, but generally what I'm going to be talking about are three hot topics. One is financial fair play, and I think that's only going to grow in terms of media exposure and understanding about actually what football clubs have to adhere to by way of financial regulations. The second thing is football and sports broadcasting issues. So I'm sure everybody over the last month, unless you've been living on Mars, will have seen the extraordinary BT deal to do with the UEFA broadcasting rights. So I'd like to talk about that, maybe have a bit of a debate, and talk generally about how live sports premium rights are escalating in value and what the reasons behind that are, and specifically also the way that people are consuming live premium sports or live premium movies in a quite different way to what how they're actually consuming it maybe 10, 15 years ago. And I think that's got a lot to do with the internet, with tablet devices, mobile devices, apps, and whether there's actually going to be a sea change away from more traditional platform-based live premium type events towards more mobile, app-based, internet-enabled devices. And so that's something of interest as well. And then the last thing, as I sort of wanted to wrap the chat up, was actually trying to link in a legal concept. And I know not all of you guys are lawyers, but the legal concepts are some of the things that I work on day to day in sport and in non-sport sectors to do with competition law, because at heart, I'm a competition lawyer and I work with clients in sport and in other sectors. And so the aim here is to try and demonstrate how competition law is affecting the way sports and rights holders and decision makers and leagues are having to consider competition law when drafting their regulations, when thinking about other types of topics that wouldn't traditionally have affected them by way of competition law challenges. And I apologise in advance if it is quite football heavy in what I'm saying, but you'll have to excuse me because I don't really know that much about other sports. So football is effectively the vehicle that I've been able to been lucky enough to work in quite a lot, but all of the topics and concepts that we're talking about do have significance and ramifications for different sports like rugby, which I'll be talking about a bit, or lots of any other commercially viable sports as well. So if we start with financial fair play, I know we're being streamed and we haven't got the microphone to hand, but does anyone want to give me an idea of what they understand financial fair play to be in the football industry? And then I can repeat it for the audience if necessary. Financial fair play. Yeah.
For me, it was basically clubs like breaking even, I guess, not spending more than they actually spending.
Yeah, so clubs breaking even, not spending more than they can, being sustainable. Yeah.
Perhaps competing clubs after the same player. Perhaps competing clubs after the same player who are trying to outdo each other with the amount of money they're going to spend on the player.
Yeah.
What's fair in terms of who's put the offer in first? Is there a contract sort of maybe?
Anything else? Yes.
I think the whole concept of it is to try and reduce the amount of clubs spend on players and stuff like that, so they don't go into debt. So there's not cases of clubs like Leeds or stuff like that. And I think UEFA are trying to combat that.
Exactly.
In terms of creating this.
So reduce the amount of spend to make it more sustainable, to make sure you don't get clubs like Leeds going into administration and having problems. Agree with all of that. And on here is effectively what UEFA has come out with over the past few years, or did in their original licensing procedure booklet, which is in relation to what their general aims were for UEFA financial fair play. And very basically anyway, the idea was over a sustained period of time, and this is applicable to different sports, football being a basket case effectively because the broadcasting rights, the huge broadcasting rights have driven an extra set of commercial imperatives to spend lots of money on players and wages, etc., which can lead to vicious cycles, as you mentioned. But the general idea is that clubs over a sustained period of time, on the whole, have been spending more than they earn, and that's either through benefactor models, through loans that owners have put in, lots of different ways. Whether that's good or not is, a debate for another day. But the general perception is that UEFA felt like they needed to do something to curb these excesses, and that's what financial fair play in the UEFA sense was there to do. I think it's probably slightly less to do with transfer fairness, etc., as you were talking about, but that can have one aspect to do with it. So if we talk generally about financial regulation in sport, there have been wage caps that are in place in rugby and other sports, but this is probably the largest exposure range that any regulation will have to probably the largest commercial sport in the world, be it football. And that's important simply because the UEFA regulations govern, I think it's 54 member associations with now Gibraltar coming in. And that obviously has an huge impact for a large number of clubs, much further than just the EU, for example. And so the point I'm trying to stress here is that you've got a regulatory body trying to impose regulations on a number of autonomous clubs if they are wanting and willing to compete in European competition. And this is where, and we'll mention it a bit later, competition law issues cross with the regulatory framework that is in place. And some of you may have seen this with, and we'll talk about it in a bit of detail in a small amount of time, the Daniel Striani challenge, who's a football agent, his challenge in the European courts, the European Commission, and then also in the national courts, challenging UEFA's financial fair play rules, his main principle being that actually they're anti-competitive. And so what I'll do is I'll set out in a second what the competition law stipulations actually are and whether they're actually applicable in this instance. So with giving you that industry snapshot, I think it's probably worthwhile to examine also that financial fair play isn't just for UEFA regulations, isn't just for clubs competing in the Champions League or the Europa League. There's also instances of clubs who are in the Premier League. The Premier League's just brought in regulations at the beginning of this season for the acceptable losses that clubs can make in its league. The Football League, which is in the league below the Premier League, has also implemented similar regulations, but with a smaller loss cap permitted. And there are lots of different sanctions in place. But if I give you a very brief and basic overview, the principles of this. For anyone that says to you that clubs cannot make a loss and still comply with the regulations isn't correct. Clubs can still make what's called acceptable losses to comply with the financial fair play regulations. And these losses differ, obviously, for which competition and which league you're competing in. But for example, the UEFA rules, you're allowed to make a €45 million loss over a 2-year period. As you can see with the Premier League, if you've got very good eyes from where you sit, the Premier League's acceptable losses are a lot larger. They're £105 million over 3 years. That's £35 million loss per season that a club can still make, and that's acceptable and allowed. And for the Football League, it's a much smaller loss, £8 million from next season, which deteriorates accordingly as the seasons go. So the point generally being is financial fair play, break even, doesn't necessarily automatically mean zero costs. Revenues have to equal costs. And based on top of that, there are certain allowances which are also permitted under the regulations. We won't need to go into that in detail now, but if there's specific questions on that, then I'm happy to take. And as Guy said, feel free to interrupt me if you completely disagree with something I'm saying. If you think all I'm talking is tosh, then that's fine. But tell me why, and then we can have a debate about it. The interesting thing about the last part in red is the sanctions side. And why that's of interest, I think, generally, or should be of interest, is because there are different sanctions for whichever competition you're competing in. For UEFA, for example, there are lots of different sanctions ranging from just a reprimand to actually expulsion from competition. From the Football League, it's either a transfer embargo or a fine. And the Premier League actually hasn't set out actually what its express sanctions are going to be. But if we, for example, make a contemporary take on this, I'm sure everyone will have seen over the last 2 or 3 weeks a Mail on Sunday article by a guy called Nick Harris, who runs a really excellent sports site called Sporting Intelligence, who wrote an article saying that he believed that if Queen's Park Rangers were promoted back to the Premier League next season, that they may maybe fined up to £80 million by the Football League for non-compliance of their rules while they were in their league, which brings a whole host of really interesting concepts and ideas, I think, which is how can the Football League, for example, fine a club that is no longer in its league? Another question may also be, will that fine, that £80 million, I'm not saying that's a correct figure, I'm not sure, only the QPR guys will know this, whether that £80 million fine will go towards the loss for adhering to the Premier League regulations? Probably is the answer. And if that £80 million fine is upheld, does that mean actually then that QPR can't compete as effectively because most of their broadcasting monies that they're due has unfortunately gone to the Football League? And then how is that 80 million redistributed? So lots of interesting questions about what will happen to QPR potentially, depending on whether they go up, down, stay the same. So that's the FFP snapshot that I just wanted to briefly talk about. And these are 3, I think, what I consider anyway, pretty relevant topics or relevant issues within financial fair play, very briefly, just for a few minutes, just to talk about. And they're the following. The first one is sponsorship agreements. So everyone will know and see in the furore around, for example, the Manchester City Etihad sponsorship deal or the PSG Qatar Tourism Authority deal as well. And I think the thing, at least from a basic perspective worth mentioning, is that these will be governed, these types of sponsorship arrangements will be governed by what's called the related party transaction provisions in the UEFA licensing requirements. And that's effectively saying that if you can find a link and a substantive link between the sponsoror and the sponsoree, then there's the possibility that UEFA may have to find out what the actual true value of the transaction would be because it hasn't been carried out on an arm's length deal. So hopefully that makes sense. So if, for example, in a very extreme case, and that's not what these cases are, the owner of a football club also owns, 100% owns another company, and that company decides to buy an executive box for £100 million for one season. when everyone knows that the market price for an executive box is £2 million, then I think UEFA in those instances may well see that that's not fair value for the sponsorship arrangement and then downgrade the deal accordingly for FFP purposes and for FFP calculations. So that's that, and I think that will, the related party transaction issues will then start playing out, I think, in the next 6 to 8 months, because that is when the first initial club financial control body decisions are going to be made. So that's the first point. The second point, I think, is probably, in my view, the most important and contentious issue overall out of everything that we're dealing with in FFP senses, which is this. There will certainly be clubs that will breach financial fair play rules, that will be over that UEFA €45 million limit. There's no doubt that that will be the case. What the actual issue is what the sanction that will be imposed will be. And I've put this question to a lot of people, and no one knows the answer really until the first set of cases go before UEFA and then go to the Court of Arbitration for Sport, and it's this. If a club, for example, is €5 million outside of what they're permitted to be able to spend, does that automatically mean that they'll be expelled from the competition? If they're 10 million, does that mean they're expelled? If they're 15 million over, 20, 25, at what level does what sanction apply? So it starts from a reprimand to a fine, to withdrawal of prize money, to not being able to register new players, to reduce the squad size, to expel in competition, to expel for future competitions, to remove titles, dock points. All of these are potential sanctions, but I think everybody, especially in the media, I think, is assuming, making an assumption that anyone in breach will automatically be expelled. And I think that's a dangerous assumption to make, because I'm not convinced from a proportionality argument, i.e., does the crime fit the punishment, from a proportionality argument that everybody who's in breach will be automatically expelled. So that's just something to bear in mind there. And the last one is something that I blogged on probably about 2 or 3 months ago. And if anyone's listening from UEFA, I spoke to UEFA a while back about it, but no one wants to give me an answer. So I think I know why they don't want to give an answer, and they're usually very good at getting back to people. But the issue is this. When clubs are having to submit their accounts, they've submitted their first set of accounts, the 11-12 accounts, only a couple of months ago. But because the 12-13 accounts are still being prepared in some cases because the year end hasn't finished, those clubs will only submit their accounts to UEFA in the springtime, in the February, March, April time next year. Which means at the very earliest, UEFA is going to be making decisions, sanctioning decisions, during the very latter stages of the Champions League and Europa League this season. So I think you can see where I'm probably going with this, which is the following. What happens if a club is found to be massively in breach of financial fair play, the break-even criteria, and they're in the semi-finals of the Champions League against a compliant team? That compliant team is obviously not going to be very happy at all that they're playing against a team that is in breach of the regulations for this season. The integrity of competition point, obviously, then is, will UEFA throw that team out of competition for this season, or will the sanction only apply for the next season? Because you can see again where I'm going with this, which is, if UEFA decide to throw them out of this season's competition at the semi-final or final stage even, you can see there being a real quick decision-making process that's going to have to be made, which might not be able to be made in time. And then issues are going to cast an expediency of being able to do that process very quickly. And what UEFA seems to suggest in their guidance is that they won't be making sanctioning decisions this season. It will be for next season. But if I was, for example, a compliant club who's playing against a non-compliant club, I wouldn't be very happy at all. And the integrity of competition issue is very much that. If the rules are there to stop people and clubs overspending, the clubs that are overspending for this season may actually get a competitive advantage. And that's the issue. Okay, so I think that's FFP. So that's FFP, box ticked for a little bit until we have any questions. Does anyone have any questions on that and some of the issues that's going on at the moment?
Have
Two.
UEFA supplied any sort of guidance as to, well, what sanctions they would provide for particular, offences? Like, because you said that they haven't really sort of clarified it whatsoever, and that there's like a media sort of outcry and generalisation on that.
Yep.
So I was just wondering, do you think that they will provide some sort of guidance or clarification as to what offence actually warrants what sanction?
So the question is for people online was what and will, and if UEFA will actually provide some type of guidance on the sanctions that can be applied for clubs in breach.
Yeah.
And I think the answer is you won't get that, at least in the public domain anyway, and what will probably happen is those decisions, those first set of decisions by the club financial control body, which is effectively the disciplinary body in UEFA, or in the CAS decisions that get published subsequently, Court of Arbitration for Sport decisions, they will effectively form some type of precedent, I think, which will say, this club is 15 million euros outside of the losses permitted, and as a result, we think that docking 5 points is probably the best thing from the group stage and a 10 million euro fine. And then clubs will gradually build up this sort of set of case law about what the sanctioning criteria would probably be, I think. Anything else?
I had a question.
Sure.
I read the QPR case, and I think if they said if QPR are 60 million in debt, then they would have to pay 80 million. But that doesn't make sense, because if they're in 60 million in debt and they have to pay another 80 million, it means there will be 140 million in debt itself. Do you think UEFA will take into account how much a club's in debt? And in terms of just giving them a sanction rather than try and think of different ways to help them come out of debt itself?
So the issue there is that it won't be UEFA that will be sanctioning, it will be the Football League for their regulations for the time that QPR are in the Football League. But the point you mentioned about debt generally is an interesting one, which is, do you help an indebted club by fining them more and putting them further in debt? So I think that's a fair question. And I think the authorities' perspective with that would be, well, you knew the financial regulations, whichever leagues were biting at a certain year. And if you knew that, then you needed to do all you could to comply and get closer to that compliance limit. And it may well be that QPR is less so because they didn't vote in the regulations, because they weren't in the league at the time, and they haven't had much time to be able to, claw back their wages and squad size accordingly. But the point being is that if, for example, the league decides not to fine QPR, then every other club will expect the same treatment. And you need to have that deterrent effect early, I think is what the leagues would say, in order to justify the actual compliance structures that they put in place. Sorry. I think we've got one more.
Is FFP justifiable in the sense that UEFA already have sanctions in place for when a club doesn't pay their creditors and players and staff and things like that? So looking at it in like an objectively justifiable sense, is it strictly necessary when you've already got those measures in place?
You've been reading Mr. Striani, haven't you?
A little bit.
Okay. So if I can do, I'll talk about that in about 3 slides' time, if that's all right, because that's actually one of the facets we'll talk about after I've sort of given that competition law background to justify why the FFP regime may be anti-competitive, if that's all right.
Okay.
But you've led me on quite nicely. Any other questions on FFP before I go on?
In terms of regulations, when they are sanctioning in CAS, would it only be the case law for that year? I mean, does it set a precedent in the sense that perhaps next season they choose to change the breach on which is actually sanctioned on?
So I think CAS will always say that they don't necessarily set precedents because it's obviously on a case-by-case, circumstance-by-circumstance basis. But, for example, when we're talking about unilateral termination of contracts and the Methusalem, Webster, De Sanctis cases, I think we're beginning to know exactly what the compensation regime is for when a player terminates, for example, or unilaterally breaches in and out of protected periods, etc. But so, this is by analogy, effectively, the more case law there is about the sanctioning regime, the greater likelihood clubs are going to be able to understand what they're likely to be faced with should they be in breach. I think is probably the answer. Anything else? Okay. So second point, second part of what we're saying is generally about sport and competition law. And I hate my slides to be too wordy, and I apologize in advance. But if I just briefly take you to the actual, stipulation, the competition law wording is actually quite important just for this sense to provide the context later on, which is the following. And I'll just read it out very quickly. So this is Article 101, which is the same as the Chapter 1 of the Competition Act provision, the Treaty of the Functioning of the EU. And it says, all agreements between... So this is the prohibition. This is effectively what companies can't do. Any agreements between an undertaking, decisions of undertakings, concerted practices, which may affect trade between member states, which have the object or effect of the prevention, restriction, distortion of competition within the internal markets. Let's leave it there. It's a long sentence. I'm sorry. But the general point of it is it stops or prevents or provides null and void any provision, contractual provision effectively, that is made by way of agreement which prevents, restricts, distorts competition in the common market. And if it comes within that prohibition, the agreement can be justified if you fulfill these criteria, i.e. effectively the positive effects of the agreement outweigh the anti-competitive features. That's quite a difficult test to be able to actually reach. And so what I want to do very briefly is just frame this argument now, which is when you're thinking about the competition law aspects, think about agreements between undertakings which prevent, restrict, distort competition in the common market. That's the general perception that we're talking about here. And the reason why that was important is because there's been a number of really interesting decisions, and we'll talk about the broadcasting issues in just a second. But competition law really does, and is beginning, I think, to have a much greater impact in the way that sports governing bodies and rights holders are thinking about drafting their regulations, thinking about from a risk and compliance perspective, actually making sure that competition law challenges, or there aren't rather competition law challenges for their regulations. And that's no better way demonstrated than by a couple of recent cases, and it's not football, you'd be pleased to know this time, but it's actually rugby. In June 2012, there was a really fascinating for a competition lawyer anyway, fascinating case involving the Rugby Football Union, the RFU, with the club London Welsh, who were promoted to the Premier Division, the top division. And what happened as a result is that London Welsh didn't fulfil what was called the minimum standard criteria. And that was the standard criteria that all clubs in the top division had to adhere to. And they didn't adhere to it because of a primacy of tenure issue. That was effectively, they didn't own their ground, which meant they couldn't guarantee that they could play their fixtures necessarily when the RFU wanted them to be able to play the fixtures. And London Welsh argued that actually the primacy of tenure point restriction in the minimum standards criteria was anti-competitive. And it was anti-competitive because it went, just as you mentioned, the proportionality point went further than what was necessary to guarantee the actual aim. And the aim was effectively to ensure that fixtures could be played at the right times for the competition's sake, but also for the broadcaster's sake, who are the main commercial partners with the RFU. And interestingly, in the end, the appeal tribunal, the appeal body, sided with London Welsh. So they said actually that the minimum standards criteria, part of the primacy of tenure point, did actually go beyond what was necessary. And one of the reasons was there were 3 clubs already in the top division that didn't have primacy of tenure anyway, as one of the points. But there were plenty of other points as well. But what I'm trying to get to, with just maybe doing a very brief summary of that, is suggesting that you can see how competition law is easing itself into the regulatory framework of lots of different types of sporting associations and sporting leagues and rights holders. And as a result of that, just as you mentioned as well, Ned fed him very nicely, now you can see that financial fair play, as we mentioned earlier, is now being challenged. And the next slide, I'll just talk about that challenge very briefly. But the point worth mentioning now is, just to stress again, competition law is being used as a sword, as an offensive weapon by certain individuals who feel that an agreement, a provision, a restriction actually goes effectively, among other things, goes beyond what's necessary for the organisation of that sport to be able to work efficiently as possible. And so what I'm trying to do is go slightly backwards before I go forward. So what we started with was financial fair play. What we're moving into now is competition law and the way that competition law affects broadcasting and FFP, for example. I'm going to talk now about FFP and competition law, and then afterwards I'm going to talk about broadcasting and competition law, so hopefully it goes full circle. And the FFP competition law challenge is this. So I'm sorry, the guys at the front might definitely not be able to read this, never mind the guys at the back. But the principle is this. I'm not convinced there will be too many people feeling sorry for football agents generally. But a football agent has challenged the financial fair play rules under competition law. So he's effectively gone to the European Commission at first instance and said to the European Commission, we believe that the financial fair play rules effectively go beyond what is necessary to achieve the aim of long-term sustainability of football and for clubs to break even, as you mentioned, and for clubs not to go into administration. And effectively, he said two arguments. The two arguments are as follows. The first one is that financial fair play stops the free movement of capital flowing throughout the European Union, which is owners or prospective owners cannot invest whatever money they want at a football club because these rules now say that you can only make a certain amount of loss. So that's the first interesting point. And the second point is, linked to that, is that FFP effectively then becomes an indirect or a direct barrier to entry for investment. And not only is it a barrier to entry for investment into football clubs through takeovers and whatever else it may be, but also it reinforces the status quo. It reinforces the biggest clubs with the largest revenues that can then incur the most costs to break even. So the established order remains. The new guys can't break into the top 4 or 5. They then can't play in the Champions League to get the greater revenues, and the status quo remains the same, and therefore the stability of the largest clubs is intact. And you can see, I can see pretty good arguments for all of those issues, but remember they're all based on that first principle, which is this is an agreement between either the UEFA member associations and or UEFA as an association of undertakings with the object or effect of prevention, distortion of competition in the common market. That's the basic framework, legal principles behind what Mr. Striani is trying to do. And he was quoted recently in a Wall Street Journal article about particular things that must be adhered to in order for the regulations to be competition law compliant. And I don't necessarily agree with the order that he said things in, but generally the idea is that for him to actually engage the competition rules, he has to justify effectively and pretty well that the rules go beyond what is necessary, the proportionality arguments of what he's saying. Whether that's actually going to happen is a different thing and a different matter. But in terms of the boring procedure side of it anyway, the thing to really bear in mind now is that you have this twin-track approach that Striani has effectively started. On one side, he's got a complaint to the European Commission. So the Commission at some point, probably in the next 6 months, has to come back to him to say, we're going to take your complaint forward, or we're rejecting the complaint. And at the same time, he started proceedings in the national courts, in the Belgian courts, for potentially, I think, for them to refer questions to the European Court of Justice based on competition law EU principles. So you've got this twin-track approach, and I've never actually seen that many instances where both things happen at the same time. And I wonder whether the EU institutions are a little bit annoyed, might be the wrong word, but administrative efficiencies might not be best placed if you have the EU doing, the Commission doing one thing, and the national courts asking questions to another EU body at the same time. There's a question at the back?
Yeah. Gianni obviously is an agent. What's in it for him? Why is he trying to?
Okay. So the question is, what's in it for Striani as a football agent?
Yeah.
So,
is he effectively saying because there can't be a free movement of capital, that will have a knock-on effect on agents?
Yeah. And it's effectively that if, for example, football clubs have to say we can't buy as many players and we can't have we can't afford the wages that we've had previously, then the commission that football agents will get, and I can see the poor sighs going around as we talk about this.
Poor agents.
Exactly. The agents do all right, but I can see the point too. That agents' remuneration commission may decrease and may not be as high as it otherwise would be if transfer fees increased, if wages then increased as a result. So he's saying that him, as an interested party, effectively will suffer as a result.
Okay.
Is that all right? Okay. And so that's effectively the Striani competition law issue. Did that sort of cover what you were talking about? Was there anything else particular that you want me to chat about there?
No, that's pretty much.
Okay, that's the right answer. And then the third and last point for the chat is this. So we've talked initially about financial fair play as one of the important sets of financial regulation that's going on at the moment, in football especially, but is in other sports as well. We've now talked about the legislative framework focus for competition law, and specifically about FFP being challenged and a weapon basically used as competition law to challenge those regulations. And now we have sports broadcasting rights, which is inherently used to, over the last probably 2 decades, used to the fact that competition law is either its best friend or its worst enemy in a lot of ways. Rights holders would probably see competition law, well, UEFA and FIFA recently have seen it in a very negative way. By the way, a number of cases have come before the General Court and the Court of Justice to do with listed events and crown jewel events. But I'd say on the other hand, you have consumers who may argue actually competition law has benefited them in some ways, but actually has had a negative impact. So, for example, I'll give one example. I think it was 2003 or 2005, or 2007, I think it was 2003, the Commission, European Commission, entered into an agreement with the Premier League that said for their future tender rights, they had to ensure that more than one broadcaster received the live Premier League rights in the UK. So the reason behind that was because from a broadcaster perspective, they wanted to encourage market entry. They wanted to encourage new guys coming into the broadcasting market, competing with Sky, being able to compete on a price basis, on a demand basis, to ensure that all of the coverage, and then that competition would occur at that broadcaster level. The problem, obviously, from a consumer perspective sometimes can be, and is necessary in the case of the Premier League instance, is that whereas consumers had to subscribe just to Sky prior to that first time, 2003, I think, now consumers have to subscribe to 2 channels. You have to subscribe to BT Sport and to Sky now. And then if you want the highlights, then you have to subscribe to Times or The Sun, and then BT for other sports as well. So whereas you had one place for the Premier League rights, now you have 2. When we're talking about the Champions League rights from 2015, we're now talking about BT having the exclusive rights to all 350 UEFA Champions League and Europa League matches, which brings with it another interesting dynamic. And the interesting dynamic is this. So whereas before you had, and has happened since the Champions League inauguration, you had a terrestrial broadcaster, ITV, at least at first instance being able to broadcast live, premium Champions League and Europa League matches. Now, from the 2013 season, it's going to be exclusively on a pay TV subscription platform. Not a single game is going to be available to be aired on free-to-air. And the issue with that, obviously, is consumers like getting something for nothing. If you're not, and very much the principle being, if you're not paying for something, if you're not paying for a product, you are the product. And so I think most consumers would have been happy to suggest that they don't mind watching a few adverts for the sake of live Champions League football, for example. The issue now is that because BT has the exclusive rights from 2015, they'll no longer be able to watch live Champions League and Europa League football on terrestrial TV. But what does that have? What impact does that have on the footballing club, consumer, sponsor landscape? Well, I think from the Premier League and club perspective, at least, is a really interesting dynamic because, as everyone probably is well aware, BT and Sky paid probably in the best part of 3 billion domestically, but the Premier League's probably being able to be paid about £5.5 billion globally for their rights. And what does that mean for the clubs? Well, it probably means an uplift of about £30 million per season starting this season, which means that the winners of the Premier League for this coming season are probably going to be earning around £90 million. And the club that finishes bottom of the Premier League is probably going to earn more money than Manchester City earned for winning it last season, the season before, Man United won last season, which is an interesting stat in itself. And that then, I think, leads on to the crown jewels argument, which I think Guy can point me in the direction. I think I talked about this last year, so I won't mention it in too much detail because you can have a look at last year's stream, which is effectively that there are certain events of such national significance that European governments are allowed to safeguard those events. So, for example, the European Championships and the FIFA World Cup, Wimbledon, the Olympics, and all of those events have to be screened to a terrestrial audience, or effectively the only broadcasters, qualifying broadcasters that can bid for those events, those live events, have to be able to reach 95% of the population in the UK. And if they can't, then they're not qualifying broadcasters for that purpose. So the issue now may become is that if the Champions League, if the Champions League is now not available on terrestrial television, might there be a move by the government to decide that some live football, Champions League football, is of such national cultural significance that it should be on free-to-air terrestrial broadcasting? Now, I know BT, for example, have said, I think, although it's not been confirmed, that some Champions League games will be shown free-to-air on their platform, but that's yet to be confirmed, and I know the finals are potentially going to be on, but we'll wait and see. Yes? It's okay?
So, the issue with free-to-air versus pay TV, is it because BT just because I read that, there was an argument that BT overspent on the rights. Is it because of that sort of BBC, ITV couldn't compete, or is it just basically that the rights, from the Premier League were just so exclusive that they just felt that it was better to make it just pay TV?
So a couple of points there. I think the first one is most pay TV operators will be able to outbid terrestrial broadcasters on the whole, as a general statement. But what had happened, for example, with the Champions League previously is that the rights had been provided effectively on a two-broadcaster partnership basis. And UEFA, for this rights round, have decided actually that if they sell their rights on an exclusive basis to one broadcaster, they can get more money. And that's effectively what's happened as a result. £899 million the BT have paid, which is an uplift of, I think, over 400 or 500 million pounds almost, based on what Sky and ITV pay at the moment.
So what happened to what you said earlier about the Premier League making sure that the rights go to different broadcasters?
So that is the issue for the Premier League rights. For the Champions League and Europa League rights, that's a really interesting debate at the moment, I think, actually, because there is no actual I don't believe there's a stipulation which says it needs to go to more than one broadcaster. But if you actually have a look at the European Commission's press release in 2003, The first bullet point of the press release effectively says it envisages 2 packages going to different broadcasters.
Right.
But that obviously hasn't happened here and must not have been the case, because I'm positive UEFA, when they were entering into their tender negotiations, would have been speaking with the European Commission and saying, we're going to put this on an exclusive basis. There's nothing in our commitments package with you to say that we have to do this any differently.
I suppose BT can argue anyway that it's sort of free, sort of pseudo-free. I mean, I'm a BT... I didn't pay anything for BT because I already had BT Line, so I suppose they can argue that point.
Well, you only have free BT for this year. I'll be extremely surprised if BT provide free access to their BT Sport for next season. They've said it's only a 1-season thing at the moment, so you wait and see. But that's, an ingenious plan, I mean, in a good way, innovative way, of being able to get a whole set of new eyeballs onto their platform and quickly. The litmus test is effectively when they have to convert those free customers into pay customers. And then that leads quite nicely, I think, on just to the last point, which is the future point, which is how premium content's being consumed. And the reason why I think this is interesting as well, because I gave a lecture yesterday, and what my first question was, how do people in this room watch live sport? And so when I asked this to this question, I'm glad there was so much audience participation there. There was 2 people out of a room of 90 students that watched live sport on their Sky decoder. Almost every other person either watched it in a pub or via their tablet device or via their mobile or, God forbid, illegally streaming it, which I didn't want to hear because obviously that's not a good thing. So my point there being is that I think my generation and generations preceding us, the younger guys, are consuming live premium content in very different ways to what my generation and up are consuming. My dad would never think to watch live Premier League matches on his iPod. Didn't even know he could do it on his iPhone until I showed him a week ago. So now he's actually considering it. There's no chance he's going to be able to do it unless I'm there. But there's that possibility. So the point generally, again, going back to the issue at hand, is I think for rights holders and broadcasters alike, there is a time coming in the not-so-distant future where I wonder whether their tender rights documents are going to have to differentiate completely their internet rights from their DTT, their digital platforms, effectively, their decoder platforms. The effective point there being is that there will certainly be a time with internet-enabled television that you don't need a decoder to be able to watch Premier League matches. Why do you need in this country to be able to do it? I can't see that. But at the moment, the only legitimate way of being able to watch, for example, live Premier League football in the UK, discounting BT for a second, is either on the Sky platform or via Sky Go. You can't watch it legitimately any other way. My question for the rights holder then becomes, why is there not a separate, standalone, monthly internet subscription that people can pay for to watch live Premier League football via Sky Sports? There's a daily through either Now TV or a mobile one, but there isn't the standalone monthly ongoing subscription, I believe anyway, unless someone tweets and tells us differently, possibly. So that's the issue there is, from a value perspective, from a innovative technological perspective, the way that consumers are consuming live premium sport and live premium movies and dramas is changing. Definitely is the case, definitely the case. You can watch it on your tablet, on the move, on the train, in the pub, down the road, wherever you want to watch it. It's no longer the exclusive domain of the couch, watching it on your big TV. And because of that, I wonder whether, just as iTunes, for example, had its Napster moment where it actually then at some point created demand for a legitimate product, that at some point in the future, the Premier League may well do the same type of thing with a separate internet subscription service. And that could be for every other different sport. It doesn't necessarily just have to be for football, and it doesn't necessarily have to be just for sport. It can be for movies or other types of premium content. So that's just something to consider as a last point. But just bear in mind also, as Guy mentioned, all the stuff that I've talked about basically is on my website, on the blog section. So feel free to go to that, have a read. Guy will circulate the slides. I'm more than happy to circulate the slides to everyone that was here, and it'll be on the stream later. And there's a couple of other links to bits and pieces. If you want to follow me on Twitter, my handle is Football Law. Ask me questions afterwards. Hopefully don't tell me if I've been rubbish, but it's been great. Thank you very much for having me.
Before we finish this up, I've got a couple of questions from the wonders of the internet. Anybody here got any other questions before I go on to these? Okay, well, we had two people who definitely were tweeting some questions. One of them, Rakesh Singh in Copenhagen. Nice to see you, or hear from you, Rakesh. He had two questions. The first one ties into the that sort of potential, the future, where it's going, and it reminded me of that point, in 1991-92 when the first B-Sky deal came along, and I couldn't believe how much money it was, and you were given the figures tonight, and whether this could be split up and different things happen. And he says, with BT entering the rights race and Al Jazeera potentially entering next time, how high can these deals go? He's asking you to be Nostradamus. What do you think?
Well, I wasn't very good last time because I thought that the rights would stay flat like the time before, and then they've, absolutely exploded by up to 70% domestically. And interestingly, some of the reports that I've written over the last, read over the last few months, suggest that actually the next deal will be a free-for-all, effectively. Is that even if you have these two extreme, I mean, let's get this in perspective. BT's market cap dwarfs Sky's market cap at the same time. BT is the large communications provider here. Even though they're not obviously as dominant in the pay TV market that Sky are. Obviously, I don't want to use dominance, actually, because it's a competition term. But the point being is that next time round, specifically because BT have got this exclusive UEFA deal now, the Sky specifically will really want to ensure that they keep at least the same amount of their packages and may have to really bid high, because they now know that BT have got those deep pockets to start a real competition. And if BT are able to actually gain more packages than they did this time, then I think people could question that actually Sky is not necessarily becoming the home of football anymore. If BT have all of the Champions League and Europa League games and a majority of the Premier League games, then there might actually be a move away from, at the moment, I think, Sky and BT effectively being somewhat complementary, and you're needing both, to actually possibly only needing BT next time, and then negating, your Sky Sports products potentially.
Do you think, to me, someone growing up where you saw very little live football on television and suddenly seeing so much now, to me there's going to be a saturation point. What do you think they'll see this as well, or do you think there's going to be more fragmentation, more rights packages? Will football eat itself? Is my question really, eventually.
Well, the interesting thing, and that came from the Murphy decision, which we didn't really talk about tonight, was that as a result of that, the Premier League tender document, when it went out to all of the European broadcasters, only allowed one 3 p.m. game. So you say a football eating itself, but at least in the foreign market, there are less games actually available at the moment to foreign broadcasters than there have been for quite a significant amount of time. But there will obviously still be a high number of games available. This country has a special insatiable appetite for live football, and especially the Premier League. Don't tell the missus, but I'm sometimes a bit bored at the weekend when I don't have 4 games to be able to watch.
Well, I went to a bar in Trondheim in Norway about 18 months ago, and there were 6 different games on at the same time. And it was like going to the football, because everyone came in just before and left at the end. It was very odd.
Yep.
But there's one more question I'll ask you as well. So thanks for that, Rakesh. Now we've got Guy Bloom, who's an Arsenal fan, but I don't hold it against him. His is more of a, he's like shrugging, going...
What's the thing for shrug in Twitter?
Yeah, I don't know. There's probably some emoticon, isn't there? But FFP, how can PSG and Monaco comply?
Added emphasis.
I had to. It was the French link to Arsenal.
So the PSG point would be what we discussed earlier, which is they're going to be in. There's no doubt. I think they're going to be in difficulty unless they can justify that the Qatar Tourism Authority deal is not a related party transaction. At the moment, that's reported to be worth 130 million euros a season, and that will get them closer to breaking even if that deal isn't downsized by the Club Financial Control Panel. And from Monaco's perspective, at the moment, Monaco aren't competing in Europe, so it's not an issue for this season now, but might be an issue for future seasons if they are to play. But I mean, you only need to look at the reports every day at the moment, which is Falcao's going to Arsenal or going to Madrid or going somewhere else. If they get 70 or 80 million pounds for Falcao, then they've been able to recoup a decent amount of their transfer spending in one fell swoop.
Excellent answer. Okay, I'll leave that the questions.
There was one question.
My main sport is not football, but from what you're predicting with BT taking over, from the main football rights, do you think that the dominance of football at BT will end up that such sports such as cricket, which is my sport, golf, will start to diminish on TV full stop? Do you think that football will grow to such a point that it will be the only sport, say, broadcast, on terrestrial and on pay TV, and that these other sports will just sort of thin away to nothing?
Well, I would actually debate whether the opposite is true, because if, for example, you have two very large competing pay TV sports broadcasters that need that exclusive content, that although football dominates the rights landscape in terms of commercial fees that are paid to the rights holder, I think you might well see the need to be able to pick up lots of different rights to cater for a lot of different markets. So I remember looking at an Ofcom report into pay TV, and also the CAT decision into the appeal that was going on at the same time. And they were saying, football dominates the sporting rights landscape for obvious reasons, that most people subscribe to Sky Sports because of football. Football is the main driver, the battering ram that Sky call it. After that, it's cricket. Darts was actually fourth, I think, as well, which is interesting. But the point, therefore, being is that if you have strong competitors needing live premium sporting content, it may actually drive the fees up for certain other sports, for, I wouldn't say niche markets, because, cricket, golf, whatever it is, still some prime time Masters events and whatever it may be. I don't think you'll necessarily see it diminish, but whether you may have to search the pay TV stations to be able to find them is a possibility.
At the moment, we're not so keen on watching cricket, we have to say. But just to sum up now, I mean, we're always delighted to have Daniel come in, and it struck me today, actually, that the last one that Daniel did on sports broadcasting that he's alluded to today is tucked away on the website. It's a really good video, so I'm going to make that more centrally located on our website. And this one that was streamed today is also going to be up as a video as well through our YouTube channel. So I'll make those much more visible. But just leaves me to say thanks again for coming in, Daniel.
Pleasure.
Thanks for the questions, some really nice questions there as well. And thanks for those of you at home, or wherever you are, on your devices, wherever they are. And thank you again.
Great.
Thanks a lot.
Cheers.